Hey, welcome back to the podcast. This is Phil Vischer. This is the Holy Post podcast. I am here with Skye Jitani.
Hi, Phil.
Hi, Skye. Are you tired? You okay? You gonna be okay?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay.
We were up late trying to save a friend's house from flooding.
Oh, yeah, that we had major rains around here. Major rains. You almost might say cataclysmic rain.
My sons were doing belly flops in the backyard.
Wow. Wow. And Christian Taylor, whose sons were doing belly flops in the backyard.
They were like treating the whole yard as a slip and slide.
That's fun until you hit a stick.
Yeah, it was a deep pond.
Okay. And Jason is here.
Hey there.
Running the controls.
It's called a stick and cry.
Yeah. He's stuck the landing, and now he needs a new kidney. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. Okay, did you hear about the lawmaker in Ohio? In the from the Bureau of Christian Lawmakers with Questionable Theology, Nino Vitale says he won't wear a mask and doesn't want others to wear one either because the face is the image and likeness of God. A Republican state lawmaker in Ohio says he won't wear a mask during the coronavirus pandemic because it covers the face, which is the likeness of God. This is the greatest, this is a quote from him, this is the greatest nation on earth, founded on Judeo-Christian principles. One of those principles is that we are all created in the image and likeness of God. That image is seen the most by our face. I will not wear a mask. When we think of image, do we think of a chest or our legs or our arms? He asked. We think of the face. I don't want to cover people's faces. That's the image of God right there, and I want to see it in my brothers and sisters.
So, okay, here's my first question.
God has a human face.
When he goes in for surgery,
yeah,
does he want the doctors and nurses wearing masks? Or would that be, theologically inconsistent?
That was a sneaky question, Scott.
I mean,
or
it seems like
when he goes skiing, does he cover his face from the cold?
Oh, Scott.
People are doing all sorts of gymnastics to try to justify what they want to do.
Do you think he just doesn't want to wear a mask and he's looking for reasons? I think he's sincere. I think doesn't sound concocted, maybe.
I don't know. I can't begin to question his motives, but I'd love to know how, if he let's assume he genuinely believes that. I want to know how consistently he believes that. Or is it just regarding this pandemic?
Right. I don't know.
I've heard some people admit honestly, and I think humbly, that I feel emasculated when I wear a mask.
Yeah.
Or,
then they're wearing it wrong.
I had a really weird opposite experience to that.
You like hiding?
No, I went to the grocery store last week sometime. And so I put my mask on in the car, and which I've done every time I've gone to the grocery store, but I also had a ball cap on. And I never have a ball cap on. I just happened to have a ball cap on because I was mowing, and I remember stepping out of the car with a ball cap and a mask on, and my brain somewhere said, I'm about to rob a bank. It was such a strong, and I actually had to stop myself and say, no, you're not. You're going to the grocery store. You are not going to rob a bank right now. But I don't think I've ever had a mask and a ball cap on at the same time before, and it turned me into a bank robber. Like I was, I had this sudden adrenaline rush of, okay, this is what you've been training for. Okay, it's showtime. Let's do this.
I had a similar feeling, a little different, which I don't know when it was, a week or two ago. I was getting out of my car to go to a grocery store, and I was putting the mask on. And I had the initial thought that someone's going to tackle me or shoot me.
Because they're going to think you're a terrorist.
Right.
Because I just when I looked at myself in the mirror in the car, I realized here's this ethnically ambiguous, Middle Eastern, perhaps Muslim-looking guy wearing a mask about to go into a public space. I've had anxiety about that in the past, but then I have to realize, okay, everyone's wearing a mask. It's not just me. This is normal.
Was your mask black?
It was dark blue. It was really dark blue. So but I have, after 9/11, I travel I've been through that enough. So I've gotten pulled over in Wheaton here, even just walking the streets.
You're not wearing that mask of yours that says God is great across the front, are you?
Allahu Akbar?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
But I don't have to, because I think people just know it from my eyes.
You just say God is great. You exude God is greatness.
Right.
Wearing masks is hard. Like I did it to go to the doctor. I actually went to the doctor last week to get a shot in my knee and to have x-rays of my back because I'm in lots of pain. And I had to wear my mask the whole time I was in there. And, it was hard to breathe. It was hot. It was annoying. Mm-hmm. And then I saw all the people in there thinking they have to wear it all the time, all day long.
Right.
It is something that we have to contend with. It makes us feel like we look a certain way, but it also feels yucky. And I think we have to deal with that reality somehow. And we have to either submit to it or we rebel against it. And I remember, one time I had to take medicine for something. It used to make me angry, and I realized I didn't want to. And it was a battle of my wills. Am I going to do what's best for me and my family and take this medicine? Or am I not? Because I don't want to. And I think that's kind of where we are with the whole mask thing. We have to decide if we're going to submit to scientific people that know better than we do, or authorities, or if we're going to rebel.
But we can always find some scientific person somewhere that will go against the majority view, and then we hold them up. And say,
that's what Facebook is for.
This is my champion. This is my champion. Walt Disney World just announced that as they reopen the parks, when they get to that point, you will have to wear a mask and practice social distancing, which has led lots of people to speculate, what's it going to be like to wear a mask when it's 95 degrees for an entire day in Central Florida outside of Disney World? How many people are going to pass out? So the crowds could be down, both because they're going to have to hold them down purposefully, but also because it's going to be kind of annoying to...
How do you social distance in those queues?
They're trying to figure that out.
And
they're trying to figure it out.
And a lot of those, I can't.
Yeah, I know. How many people can go in the Pirates of the Caribbean boat?
Right. And given the cost, and we've talked about this before, given the expense of going to these Disney parks.
Yeah. Wouldn't you
do you really want to go and spend that much money for that experience?
Right. I don't even know.
Hard sell.
Did you hear what happened to Brian May, the lead guitarist?
I don't even know who Brian May is.
He's the lead guitarist of Queen.
Oh, right. With his bottom. We brought this in last week.
No, we didn't. You said it to me. You said it to me. Wait. Don't give it away. Okay. Because I think it might just qualify as news of the butt.
And now it's time for news of the butt.
I know, and I sent it to you. I can't believe it. What was I thinking?
It was your fault. Okay, Brian May hospitalized after injuring buttocks in, quote, over-enthusiastic gardening incident. Queen guitarist Brian May has revealed he ended up in a hospital after injuring his buttocks during an incident in his garden. He wrote on Instagram, I managed to rip my gluteus maximus to shreds in a moment of over-enthusiastic gardening.
Did he sit on did he sit on a metal rake or something?
He will not say anything more than that. So we have to speculate. I need each of you to speculate. How did Brian May injure his butt while gardening over enthusiastically? Okay, Skye?
Well, I already mentioned he could have sat on a metal rake. Maybe he was pulling weeds so vigorously that he was squatting, like jumping and squatting and pulling weeds and ripped. He's an older guy now.
Boy, I don't know. I don't see that. I'm killing that one. Okay, Jason, you have to play too.
So similar theory to Skye's, but instead of weeds, I think it was turnips. And it's been a particularly difficult turnip season in England. I don't know if anyone knew that. I didn't know that until I just said it. And so he definitely was pulling too hard and just happened.
But you'd think that would hurt your back
on a turnip. Have you seen how Brian May picks turnips? It's unusual. Let's just say it's unusual. Okay, Christian Taylor, how did Brian May injure his buttocks in a gardening incident?
Yes, well, I think that he was trying to extract carrots from the ground. And in doing so, he pulled so hard and fell back into the cactus that was behind him.
Oh, the cactus. Yes. That's so popular in the classic British garden. The cactus.
I thought he was growing weed.
He was growing weed or pulling weeds.
I think he was smoking weed.
Smoking weed.
Which they just he refers to euphemistically as gardening.
I'm going to say he's embarrassed to say he didn't understand how a weed eater worked, and he was using it very, very wrong. What? That's hard. That's hard to figure out what exactly an overenthusiastic gardening incident could do to your buttocks. Anyway,
somebody knows. The truth has to come out.
The truth will come out eventually, and this has been the news of the butt. What's your favorite Queen song other than Bohemian Rhapsody?
Oh, goodness.
Can't Stop Me Now. Or Don't Stop Me Now. Sorry.
You know, my son Isaac is a huge Queen fan. He's got like
really
a ton of their songs. Yeah.
Wow.
He listens to them all the time. I'm trying to think of what he's played a lot of.
Interesting.
Isn't We Are the Champions, Queen?
Yeah.
That's my favorite.
It's part of We Will Rock You, though. It's kind of...
Yeah.
Right.
We will. Okay. You don't have to come up with one, Skye. You're taking this
I'm
altogether
blanking.
too seriously.
I am thinking about it too seriously. Hold on. I got to look it up. Go ahead.
No.
Proceed.
You know what we can talk about? We can talk about how I love the Queen music in A Knight's Tale. Do you guys remember that with Heath Ledger?
In A Knight's Tale. Did they make new stuff or did they use old stuff?
No, they
remember.
They used the stuff, but they repurposed it, I think.
What about the original stuff? Did any of you see the movie Flash Gordon, the 80s version, in the theater when it came out?
Yes.
No,
you did not.
I did. I was really young. I remember my dad taking me.
Really? You saw Flash Gordon in the theater when it came out?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you remember the Queen theme song?
No.
Flash! Ah!
Yes. Yeah. I didn't know that was Queen.
Yeah, that was Queen. Queen did the music for Flash Gordon. Okay.
Okay. Here's this.
Flash! Ah!
Somebody to Love.
No,
Somebody to Love. That's the
a good one.
Oh, that is a great one.
Yeah.
Yes, especially the Jordan guy. Jordan, what's his name from The Voice? His version of it was he did on The Voice that kind of won The Voice was the best.
This has been the news of the butt.
Okay, we have something big to talk about here.
Yes.
So I have to start.
Eddie Haskell just died. That's so sad. Breaking news.
Eddie
The guy who
Haskell,
played him, or
Yeah, the guy who played.
Yeah, from Leave It to Beaver.
Jason, you know who Eddie Haskell is?
Leave It to Beaver. Yeah, he's you can't trust him.
Okay. Yeah, you can't trust him.
It wasn't COVID,
Eddie
was
Haskell.
it?
Was it COVID?
I don't know.
Was it an over ambitious gardening accident?
It was not over ambitious gardening.
Okay. Well, just got to check. Now I feel like I have to ask that about every unexplained death. Were they in the garden? Were they in the garden?
Brian May didn't die.
Are you sure?
No,
Yeah.
he didn't.
Are you sure? He's gone silent on Instagram. He says it's because he's recovering, but how do we know that's even him talking? Maybe it's whatever ate him in the garden, got his phone, and is now tweeting as Brian May. Okay.
This is a good transition to our conspiracy theory conversation.
Yes, it is. Yesterday, we're recording this on a Monday. Yesterday was a Sunday. I got a text from Skye Jitani at some point yesterday saying, hey, read this story. And then 4 hours later, I got a text from my brother, Rob, in Minneapolis saying, hey, read this story. And it was the same story.
And Rob and I did not communicate about it.
No, as far as I know.
So this is independent recommendations.
Yes. So I had to read the story. It is a huge article from, I think it's probably the cover story. Is it the cover?
Yeah.
Of The Atlantic?
I tried to read it, and it was so long, I decided I would wait for you to synthesize it for me.
Have you heard of QAnon? QAnon. You'd heard of it, Skye, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Jason, you'd heard of QAnon? which stands for Q Anonymous. Okay. It's a huge article on the prophecies of Q. American conspiracy theories are entering a dangerous new phase. Bum, bum, bum. Okay, the intro is kind of interesting. If you were an adherent, no one would be able to tell. You would look like any other American. You could be a mother. You could be a young man in headphones across the street. You could be a bookkeeper, a dentist, a grandmother icing cupcakes in her kitchen. You may well have an affiliation with an evangelical church, but you are hard to identify just from the way you look, which is good because someday soon dark forces may try to track you down. You understand this sounds crazy, but you don't care. You know that a small group of manipulators operating in the shadows pull the planet's strings. You know that they are powerful enough to abuse children without fear of retribution. You know that the mainstream media are their handmaidens in partnership with Hillary Clinton and the secretive denizens of the deep state. You know that only Donald Trump stands between you and a damned and ravaged world. You see plague and pestilence sweeping the planet and understand that they are part of the plan. You know that a clash between good and evil cannot be avoided, and you yearn for the great awakening that is coming, and so you must be on guard at all times. You must shield your ears from the scorn of the ignorant. You must find those who are like you, and you must be prepared to fight. You know all this because you believe in Q. Da, da, da. That'd be a good start for a movie.
A little melodramatic.
Do you think? You think? Have you ever seen The Matrix?
Yeah.
Any of its follow-ups? It all started way back in 2016 with the Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria. Remember the story of the Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria? It was the pizzeria that supposedly Hillary Clinton and other elites were holding children as sexual slaves in the basement. And that led to a man named Edgar Madison Welch, a deeply religious father of two, who took his AR-15 assault rifle and drove up to Washington, D.C. to free the children that were enslaved in the basement of the Comet Ping Pong pizza restaurant, only to discover that the pizza restaurant had no basement. That was called Pizzagate. Those stories came about with people reading some of the emails that had been released on WikiLeaks from the head of the Hillary Clinton campaign, and making some really weird connections between emails and some mentions of this pizza restaurant. And once that didn't go anywhere, those same ideas kept bouncing around online until they've coalesced into something, a series of prophecies that are being issued by a person who calls themselves Q, and no one knows who they are. He is anonymous. He, she, it, are anonymous. They are anonymous. And so it's called QAnon. And it has built into a nationwide, if not global, following of, I don't know, what do you call it? But the kind of conclusion of the Atlantic article is that we're kind of seeing the birth of a new American religion, which is fascinating. So if you paid attention to the right voices on the right websites, you can see in real time how the core premises of Pizzagate were being recycled, revised, and reinterpreted. Millions of people paying attention to sites like 4chan and Reddit could continue to learn about the secretive and untouchable cabal, the people running the world, about its malign actions and intentions, about its ties to the left wing and specifically to Democrats, and especially to Clinton, about its bloodlust and its moral degeneracy. You could also, and this would prove essential, read about a small but swelling band of underground American patriots fighting back. So that's what QAnon is. It's American patriots fighting back against the cabal of elites that eat children and trap them in pizza restaurant basements that don't exist. And it's not getting smaller, it's growing.
Okay, here's my question.
Yeah.
Do you think there's like one person out there that is trying to plant stories to create this sort of division and stuff?
Well, they speculate in the article about who might be behind this. And one of the ideas is that, these conspiracy theories thrive on these very covert websites. It used to be 4chan, then became 8chan, and now it's developed into some other things. And they become so popular that there's one theory that the people running these websites have created this Q phenomenon in order to keep the traffic on those sites going in order to generate more revenue for themselves. So essentially it's all a ploy just to make money. And there's become this cottage industry that's grown around it of selling books and merchandise and all kinds of other things. So they need to keep it going. And what started perhaps as just one person online posing as Q has turned into a big money-making racket, and people don't realize that they're being duped into it by nothing. It's basically just a money-making scheme.
But couldn't that be investigated, and shouldn't that be investigated?
Yeah,
well,
but if you're good at being anonymous online, it's hard to find out who you are.
That's the point of those sites, is they can't, unlike Facebook and Twitter and other social media sites where you can, through court orders and other ways, find out who's behind a different account. You can't do that on these sites. That's the point of it.
So it could be a group of people that are sharing an account. It could be one person. It could be Russian agents. It could be anybody. As the virus was spreading, a series of ideas began burbling in the QAnon community that the coronavirus might not be real, that if it was, it had been created by the deep state. That the hysteria surrounding the pandemic was part of a plot to hurt Trump's reelection chances, that the media elites were cheering on the death toll. Some of these ideas would make their way onto Fox News and into the president's public utterances. As of late last year, Trump had retweeted accounts often focused on conspiracy theories, including those of QAnon, on at least 145 occasions.
What's crazy is at one point in the article, they say at least 35 current or former congressional candidates have embraced Q.
That is crazy.
Like, this is not just a fringe kind of backwater of the internet kind of thing. It's influencing American policy and lawmakers.
Yeah. Yeah. So the article says the group harnesses paranoia to create hope and a deep sense of belonging. The way it breathes life into an ancient preoccupation with end times is also radically new. To look at QAnon is to see not just a conspiracy theory, but the birth of a new religion. So that's interesting. So they're saying there's a big crossover between the evangelical fundamentalist tradition of reading the times and coming up with connections behind the scenes and a new world order and, you know, the elites or the European Union that's going to take over the world. And it's the same kind of connection to, yes, there are elites behind the scenes that pull all the strings and run the world, but there is a coming reckoning. Basically, QAnon has a built-in day of the Lord element when everything is going to be set right. You know,
and uses a lot of Christianese language, which makes it very appealing to people who are familiar, like, you know, prayer and Jesus and apocalyptic language that anybody who's been in that subculture for the last 30 years, they're going to recognize and go, oh, maybe Q is one of us, which makes that much more appealing to them.
Yeah. So in its broadest, here are the beliefs, as much as you can paint them. In its broadest contours, the QAnon belief system looks something like this. Q is an intelligence or military insider with proof that corrupt world leaders are secretly torturing children all over the world. The malefactors are embedded in the deep state, and Donald Trump is working tirelessly to thwart them. The eventual destruction of this global cabal is imminent, Q prophesies, but can be accomplished only with the support of patriots who search for meaning in Q's clues. To believe, remember that kids show, Q's Clues? That was fun. We should do that. That would be okay. To believe Q requires rejecting mainstream institutions, ignoring government officials, battling apostates, and despising the press. One of Q's favorite rallying cries is, "You are the news now." Another is, "Enjoy the show," a phrase that his disciples regard as a reference to a coming apocalypse. We're all spectators for the end of the world.
Okay, there's one part of this that I found most intriguing,
Yes.
and that was the part that had to do with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So the article interviews a bunch of people who are kind of disciples of Q and really into it, and they're all significant Trump supporters because it's one of the core tenets of the conspiracies that Trump is, fighting these.
Trump
deep
is
state
the Lone
actors.
Ranger attacking the cabal of child molesters.
Right. But so here's what was really interesting to me. I mean, just forget interpreting anything at this point. If you just look at Trump's behavior, his tweets, his sometimes odd rhetorical skills, you just look at that and it's clearly does not conform to earlier models of what a president says and does. And there's two extreme ways of interpreting it. One extreme way is to say Trump is truly dumb and an idiot and doesn't know what he's doing, and kind of the way a lot of the people on the extreme left view him. The way the QAnon supporters view it is they're looking at the same kind of crazy behavior, but behind it, they interpret it as crazy like a fox, that it's all secret messages and symbols, and his tweets, which seem sometimes incoherent, are actually secret messages that are all have to do with Q. So it's in one way, it's an amazing way of reconciling the cognitive dissonance between believing that Donald Trump is God's man and his actual behavior and actions and words to say, well, he's smarter than everyone else out there. He's so smart that everyone thinks he's dumb.
Yeah.
And that is just an absolutely brilliant way of trying to reconcile what we're seeing right now.
Some people believe Trump is actually Q.
Yeah.
That he's the one that's outing everything behind the scenes. And he tweeted on March 9th, wait a minute. Trump himself retweeted a QAnon-themed meme, which was a picture of himself, his face photoshopped onto someone who was playing a violin, overlaid with the words, "Nothing can stop what is coming." And he retweeted that himself and said, "Who knows what this means, but it sounds good to me." Me playing the violin while something is coming that no one can stop.
And that's a phrase that's common in the QAnon subculture.
Yes. The next day, Q himself retweeted that tweet, or reposted that tweet of Trump's, and then added, "The Great Awakening is worldwide," and then another post that simply said, "God wins." On April 8th, Q went on a posting spree, dropping 9 posts over the span of 6 hours and touching on several favorite topics: God, Pizzagate, and the wickedness of the elites. Another accused Democrats of promoting mass hysteria about the coronavirus for political gain. And then he shared these verses from Ephesians: "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil." So it doesn't seem like it's a bunch of, atheist nerds in a basement somewhere, unless it's just a joke. What's the possibility that it's just a joke and someone is just laughing their head off that they're creating a new religion from their basement?
It wouldn't be the first time.
No, it wouldn't. It wouldn't.
What if it's more nefarious? What if it actually is, like evil
Russian
actors? Evil actors outside of the United States that's pulling the strings for this.
That's certainly possible.
That also wouldn't be the first time.
You can buy Q buttons and T-shirts. You can buy Great Awakening coffee, QAnon bracelets with tiny silver pizza charms. So there's a whole world.
So what's interesting is, was there no blowback when Pizzagate clearly was exposed as fraudulent?
There's an explanation for that too.
They said the intel on that wasn't 100%.
So speaking of that, Christian, in the article, the writer interviews a couple of, I think from Ohio, a couple of people who are big Q supporters.
Yes.
And one of the tenets of Q, and the reason why people believe he or she or they are credible, is Q will predict events. And so the writer asked these people, and he says, I asked them for examples of predictions that had come true. They could not provide specifics and instead encouraged me to do the research myself. When I asked them how they explained events that Q had predicted that never happened, such as Hillary Clinton's arrest, they said that deception is part of Q's plan. So in other words, everything Q predicts that doesn't come true is because Q is deliberately using those deceptions to further, they have an explanation for everything that doesn't conform to their narrative. And it's all part of Q's plan. So you can't, even when things are proven to be completely wrong, like Pizzagate, they just reconcile it by saying, well, that was part of the plan.
Yeah. So what
are we to do with this? Again, it's the same question that I had the last time.
A guy named we're to know more. We're to know more. Arthur Jones, the director of the documentary film Feels Good Man, which tells the story of how internet memes infiltrated politics in 2016, says that QAnon reminds him of his childhood growing up in an evangelical Christian family in the Ozarks. He said many people he knew then and many people he meets now in the most devout parts of the country are deeply interested in the book of Revelation and in trying to unpack all of its pretty hard to decipher prophecies. He wanted to say, I think the same kind of person would all of a sudden start pulling at the threads of Q and start feeling like everything is starting to fall into place and make sense. So it seems that you're dealing with people that can't make sense. You know, it's a confusing time. Whenever it's a really confusing time and you can't make sense of the world, you want some system so you can start connecting the dots and making sense of things and find patterns. And this, the book of Revelation is one that people have used, you know, for a long time to try to make sense of confusing times. And this is now an alternative book of Revelation, basically, which is a guy in a basement somewhere posting prophecies like Nostradamus, and all of us saying, wow, chase after that one, go down that rabbit hole. An active subsection of Q followers probes the Jeffrey Epstein case. There are those who claim knowledge of a 16-year plan by Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama to destroy the United States by means of mass drought, weaponized disease, food shortages, and nuclear war. So it doesn't seem like it can't be too crazy. You know, there's nothing you can do that's too crazy to be believed as a possibility.
And there's no accountability. At another point in the article, he tries to interview a guy who's one of the leading proponents of QAnon, and he said he responded to his emails but declined requests for an interview. He complained to me that journalists refuse to see QAnon for what it really is and therefore cannot be trusted. In other words, I'm not going to allow you to interview me because you're part of the media, and the media automatically is...
You don't get it.
You don't get it. So they have no accountability. There's no one to call them out. And I was tweeting about this a couple of weeks ago, but you know, the whole connection with Revelation is we've had decades of fundamentalists and some evangelical Christians being shaped by the whole subculture of eschatology and end times prophecy, and you know, all the conspiracy theories that floated around that, which really primed them to be receptive to something like QAnon. So it didn't come out of nowhere. This has been decades in the making, and that's why I think so many Christians are drawn to this, because they've been taught to think this way.
So they interviewed a guy from the University of Miami who specializes in research on conspiracy theories. And he said, to think of conspiracy thinking, it's independent of party politics. It's a particular form of mind wiring. And it's generally characterized by acceptance of the following propositions. Our lives are controlled by plots hatched in secret places. Although we ostensibly live in a democracy, a small group of people run everything, but we don't know who they are. When big events occur, pandemics, recessions, wars, terrorist attacks, it is because that secretive group is working against the rest of us. Q appeals to people with the greatest attraction to conspiracy thinking of any kind, and that appeal crosses ideological lines. So it's not necessarily far right or far left. It's people who believe there's a system, a secret system, it works against me, and we need to figure out who's behind it, and we need to stop them. And I guess why I bring it up is because of the similarity to a lot of the conspiracy thinking in Christian circles right now. Because they would all point to people like, you know, Bill Gates, whether you're, you know, anti-vax or QAnon or you're worried about the Antichrist, you're all pointing at Bill Gates right now, saying that guy's trouble. We got to do something about that guy.
Can I say something that might remedy that? I would invite people to watch Inside Bill's Brain. Have you seen this?
No, I haven't. Well, I've seen it, that it's up there on, is it Netflix?
Yeah. Inside Bill's Brain is on Netflix. It's a documentary series that, you know, interviews him and sort of follows how he thinks and his whole life. And it is super interesting. And you realize he is just a normal guy, but he tries to use the things at his disposal, be they his big brain or the finances that he has, his big pocketbook, to really help the world.
Christian.
And yeah.
That's exactly what Bill wants you to think.
Oh, gosh.
Mm-hmm.
See, there's always an out.
Mm-hmm.
Except the thing is, like, this guy is spending his time and his money
Christian
making toilets that can be used in Africa in a place where there's no, like septic system.
Yeah, but those toilets are analyzing their poop and then tracing exactly where they've been, and it's all going into a supercomputer.
Yeah. And
well, okay, you know what that does? That presupposes evil at the heart.
Yes.
Like when my husband and I got remarried, I remember him saying to me, Christian, you always assume the negative about me. Like if we would get in a fight about something and over a course of time, I realized that I was operating, my default operating system was that I'm just going to assume you have a bad motive behind whatever you're doing or whatever you're telling me.
Yeah.
It was a great challenge to me. And I realized that I needed to do that with just about everybody in the world. I need to give them the benefit of the doubt always.
Yeah.
And expect that they're good, not bad.
Well, then you're falling right into Bill Gates' trap. If you give him the benefit of the doubt. This is what they talk about other famous conspiracy theories, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the moon landing, 9/11. There are conspiracy theories about all these things. But QAnon is different. They say it may be propelled by paranoia and populism, but it is also propelled by religious faith. The language of evangelical Christianity has come to define the Q movement. QAnon marries an appetite for the conspiratorial with positive beliefs about a radically different and better future, and one that is preordained. So there is a plan. It's going to be great. It's coming. We just have to get through these terrible times, and then we'll get to the promised land. We'll get to the New Jerusalem right around the corner.
Okay. Two things jump to my mind right away that when you bring that up, Phil. Number one, remember ISIS? Wasn't that long ago that was like the big story, right?
Yes, right.
The Islamic State in Iraq and Syria and all the horrible things that were going on there, and people flying from all over the world to join ISIS and become ISIS.
Simpler days. Don't you ever long for?
And their whole goal was to set up Sharia law all over the world.
Well, not exactly. When you actually study ISIS and what they believed, they were trying to reconstitute a caliphate in the Middle East, right, an Islamic State, because they believed it was going to provoke Armageddon. They believed that the world would end when there was a cataclysmic war between Islam and Christianity, and Islam would actually lose, that it would be defeated, and at the moment of defeat, Jesus would return, not Jesus, the Christian Messiah, but Jesus, the prophet of Islam, and vindicate Islam. And so what they were actually trying to do is provoke the final battle between good and evil in the world. It was an apocalyptic death cult. That's what ISIS was. But they believed that you had to establish this state and provoke this war and everything else to make it happen. And you see the undercurrent of that same way of thinking in QAnon. There's this cataclysmic battle between good and evil that's coming. And the bad guys are the liberals, and the good guys are Trump and his supporters, and the Christians who are on that side. It's the same way of thinking. And this is nothing new. I mean, this goes way, way back. Even the New Testament talks about these kinds of conspiracy theory stuff with Gnosticism and other secret knowledge. And Paul warns about this. And he said, hey, what I've taught you, I've taught out in the open. There's no secrets here. It's just the gospel. And anybody who adds anything to that is leading you astray. But the appeal of a secret knowledge, if you're the one pushing it, is everyone else out there is lying to you, and I alone have the truth, therefore trust me, and oh, by the way, give me money, buy my stuff, get access to my sources. This has been the appeal of end times prophets, I'm using air quotes, and conspiracy theorists from the get-go. And it's really a monopoly to say everyone else is wrong, you can only trust me, and it's a way to make a ton of money. And it's really sad because people want that feeling of safety and security, like we've got it figured out and we're going to be okay, and so they're more inclined to trust those people who claim to have it all figured out.
The guy from Miami that studies conspiracy theories had to confess to the reporter from The Atlantic that his mother was now a QAnon follower, and so the reporter interviewed his mother. And she had some interesting things to say. She says she likes that Q occasionally quotes from Scripture, and she likes that he encourages people to pray. In the end, she said, QAnon is about something so much bigger than Trump or anyone else. She said, there are QAnon followers out there who suggest that what we're going through now in this crazy political realm we're in, with all of the things that are happening worldwide, is very biblical, and that this is Armageddon. But she loves that there's hope. Q, she actually said this, Q gives us hope, and it's a good thing to be hopeful. So, and this is someone who's, who's a biblically literate, who would, say,
what is the hope Q is giving?
That the end is coming and we win, and that we'll defeat Bill Gates and Hillary Clinton and their evil minions, and we'll bring
but why do you have to
age.
If you're a Christian, why are you adding that?
Why do you need that?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
That's a good
And
question.
in the process, coming to view your fellow countrymen as essentially demonic forces that need to be defeated, rather than a neighbor to be loved.
Right. That is the difference right there between the QAnon culture and the Scripture. And that is, I'm seeing this dichotomy in our culture where, Jesus says, yes, there is going to be this division and there is going to be these terrible times, but he calls us to love and to serve one another, put others first, and not think of people as enemies and not be fighting for our rights. That all of a sudden has become a huge, contradictory message in our culture.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So I've heard of QAnon over the last couple of years, but I'd never taken the time to say, okay, what is that exactly? And thanks to the Atlantic, I just got a deep dive into it. And so we wanted to share that with you guys and say, all right, well, keep an ear open for people kind of merging biblical prophecy, typical stuff with some really unusual stuff, especially about elites and Hillary Clinton and the coronavirus. And when all of that's getting mucked together, there may be more going on. The question is, can you do anything about it? Because what do you
recommend we say?
Yeah, it sounds like a belief system that's pretty well inoculated against any external critique.
Two things. Number one, Julie, if you're listening, I hope you'll remind us to put in the show notes a link to this article so other people can read it. It's really long, but
Yes.
if you're bumping into this kinds of stuff in your Christian community, you might want to read it and be informed so you can talk thoughtfully about it. But secondly, rather than going straight at somebody who's holding these views and saying you're wrong or here's all the reasons you're wrong, I think it would probably be more fruitful to say, how is what you are absorbing from QAnon consistent with or inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus? And if you're claiming to be a Christian and claiming that you're following him, then any teaching, no matter what it is or where it comes from, needs to be held up against that. And if it's causing you to fear your neighbors more than love them, if it's causing you to be filled with more anger and hatred of others rather than compassion and kindness, then you have to ask about the fruit that's really being born here, and is it of God or not?
Great question, Skye.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So that's fun. Come to holypost.com and leave your thoughts. Have you been seeing this stuff bubble up? What do you think of it? Is it intriguing? Have you tried to talk to anybody about it and talk them down off the Hillary Clinton keeps children as slaves cliff? And let us know. So go to theholypost.com, leave your thoughts, go to Patreon and support us. And we will see you again next week. Thanks for listening in.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Charlie Tremendous Jones once said, quote, 5 years from today, you will be the same person you are today, except for the books you read and the people you meet, end quote. Right now in With God Daily, we're doing a series called Saints, in which I'm introducing you to the people and the books that have changed who I am. Some are Christians you might expect, like C.S. Lewis or Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but you'll also discover women and men who you may have never heard of, or who may have been from way outside your own church tradition. People like Shusaku Endo, Dorothy Day, or Desmond Tutu. And each devotional in the series isn't just a biographical sketch. We're dealing with some really important issues like forgiveness, justice, prayer, and mission. If you're looking for a larger perspective on your faith, and if you want to meet people and discover books that will change you forever, this is the series for you. You can sign up for With God Daily with a tax-deductible donation of any amount by going to withgoddaily.com. You'll get the daily email, access to the mobile app with the full archives, and the brand new audio version of With God Daily. So check out With God Daily today. It's the devotional for people who hate daily devotionals. I'm really happy to have Dave Swanson with us today on The Holy Post. Dave is an old friend of mine who I really respect. He was formative for me in my early years of pastoral ministry before he moved to Chicago to take a church in the Bronzeville neighborhood where he's been for a number of years now. He's also the author of a brand new book, his first book, called Rediscipling the White Church. Really grows out of Dave's own experience in a multi-ethnic neighborhood and also as a missionary kid, just living in a cross-cultural dynamic and helping us to see the issue of race and racism through the lens of discipleship rather than just through social issues and politics. So here's my conversation with David Swanson. David Swanson, welcome to the Holy Post.
Thanks for having me, Skye.
Yeah, before we jump into the content of your book, we should probably give some people some background on where you're from and what you're doing. You and I first became friends years and years ago when I was a young pastor at a suburban church in Wheaton, and you were a young pastor at a suburban church in Glen Ellen, right next door to Wheaton. And we kind of would get together and share, I don't know if Sharon's right, more commiserate around some of the dynamics, because I'm not sure either of us expected to be in that environment.
Right.
And then fast forward 20 years, I'm still here, and you've left me.
Sorry, man.
Yeah, so to kind of update people on your, sketch out your journey in ministry and where you are now.
Yeah. I think when we first started getting to know each other, my wife and I had moved up from North Carolina a few years prior to that so that I could attend Wheaton Graduate School. I was there for a few years, great experience. And then, despite all of my ambivalence about suburban life, the church that we were part of was really a healthy community doing great ministry, and kind of experienced my call to ministry through that church. And they eventually called me as an associate pastor, which I will forever be thankful for. Why they called a 25-year-old to be a pastor of adult ministries, I'll never know. But hopefully I didn't do too much damage there. And yet I always did kind of have this heart for multiracial ministry. I think in large part, I was a missionary kid, grew up in Venezuela and Ecuador up until my high school years. My dad was a pilot, flying small little airplanes around some relatively remote areas of those countries. And so grew up in that environment. And so I think always kind of felt a little bit more comfortable in cross-cultural situations, but also had a sense that the gospel really accomplished something significant for those first believers in the context of the Roman Empire, where people were reconciled to one another in a way that was completely unexpected. And that seemed at the time like something I wanted to experience and I wanted to see happening, and seemed to me would be an incredible witness to our relatively segregated society. And so was called into the city to a church on the north side of Chicago that was doing really good intentional multiracial ministry there. And then about 18 months later, much sooner than expected, they sent myself and a small group of folks out to start a church on the south side of Chicago, also with a vision of being an intentionally multiracial congregation for the sake of the gospel. And so we planted that church, New Community Covenant Church, 10 years ago. We were supposed to be celebrating our 10-year anniversary right now. We were gearing up for it and had all kinds of great plans, and kind of having to rethink that now given our circumstances. But for the past 10 years, we've lived here on the near south side of Chicago in our church is in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. The church itself is very ethnically and racially diverse. Small congregation doing our best to serve faithfully in ministry in our context.
And for those who are not watching this, but only listening to the audio, just to set the context a little bit, you are a white guy.
I am. I absolutely am.
You are. But having grown up as a missionary kid in South America, you have a lot of third culture, kind of cross-cultural experience and wisdom. But South Side Chicago is not Venezuela or Ecuador or suburban Chicago. It's a whole different thing. But that skill set is certainly transferable. So 10 years you've been in that setting now. You've had a lot of experiences and learned a lot. And you've written a new book, which the title alone is provocative, but it's called Rediscipling the White Church. Let's get into this a little bit because, I mean, there's been a lot written for years now about race and religion in the United States, Divided by Faith kind of being a watershed book that illustrated and documented the divisions that we have even among Christians between African Americans and Anglo Americans. And there's been a lot of different people diagnosing the problem. But you come down squarely on the idea that this is first and foremost a failure of discipleship. So talk about why you frame it that way rather than the 10 other ways it could have been framed.
Sure. Yeah, and there certainly are other fruitful ways to think about this. I wouldn't want to say that this is the only way to get at it. But to get to your question, it's helpful for me to think about what is the problem itself that we would be attempting to address. And not everybody would say that it's a problem, right? There are plenty of folks, Christian folks, who would say, our churches are fine the way they are. Yep. And the differences that we see culturally, racially are a matter of personal or cultural preference. That's not how I would understand our situation. Historically, culturally, sociologically, I think there are reasons our churches are segregated that are actually antithetical to the gospel that these same churches preach. The gospel message is one, as Paul says, that reconciles us with our Creator God, but also with one another. And yet there's a history in our country within white Christianity of racial and ethnic exclusion. And that this is in some ways kind of fundamental to many forms of white Christianity, that we imagine ourselves first to be white in some ways before we imagine ourselves to be Christian. Now, that's not something that necessarily most of us are thinking about most of the time. And yet, if you kind of step back and say, what do white Christians have in common with other people? It seemed to me that oftentimes white Christians, that we had more in common with, say, white non-Christians than we did with, African American Christians or, Christians who are more recent immigrants to our country. That in terms of how we lived, what was important to us, what we cared about, who we found ourselves in solidarity with, oftentimes race was a better predictor of these things than our Christian faith.
That's certainly been proven politically with survey after survey.
That's right. And I think, the more contentious the political times are, the more evident this seemed to me. And I don't mean to say that our times are more contentious or divided now than they were in the past. We can let historians debate that. But in these contentious moments, as people are finding themselves sort of picking sides and choosing sides, I think that's where our loyalties and our default allegiances are made known. And I have found myself over the years in conversations with other white Christians, often around politics, sometimes around cultural issues, where they are expressing strongly held opinions about what is right or what is politically expedient. And I'll ask a question, well, what about, your sister or your brother in Christ, who maybe attends the church just down the street, it's a Black church or it's an immigrant church, who experiences this very, very differently than yourself. Mm-hmm. And time again, I was told, well, they just don't really understand this. They just don't really get this. There was a way in which my conversation partners were kind of narrating the experience of that Christian of color, rather than expressing a curiosity, saying, well, yeah, I don't really know why that difference exists. And I kind of wonder about that. And it doesn't totally seem right. And maybe I could lean into that a little bit more. And so that for me was the kind of fundamental thing that was the itch in my head. Why is that? Why is it that oftentimes as white Christians, we find more in common with other white people than we do with the diverse family of God that we belong to through the blood of Jesus? And that's what then got me thinking in terms of discipleship.
So in the first kind of section of the book, you talk about what is essentially white. What does it mean to be discipled into whiteness? I mean, I can already sense people hearing me say that and get defensive. Right?
Yeah, of course.
I'm not discipled into being white. I'm discipled into being a Christian. So define that a little bit for us. What does that mean? I mean, you've articulated that a lot of white Christians identify more with other white non-Christians, but what is it they are exactly identifying with?
Yeah. So Dallas Willard is super helpful. I think anybody thinking about discipleship, Willard is a great voice. And I patched together my own definition of discipleship, but borrowing heavily from him. And I would say that as Christians, when we're talking about discipleship, we're talking about following Jesus in order to become like Jesus, to do what Jesus does in the world. And of course, all of this is possible by the invitation of Jesus and the death and resurrection of Jesus. But there's a following, becoming, doing element to this.
He uses the metaphor of apprenticeship.
Right. Exactly.
Which using contemporary language makes a lot of sense, because it's what you're saying. You got to be with that person to learn from that person to replicate that person's behavior. And
I'm not just trying to get some
skills.
Information in my head, right? I'm looking for a complete transformation for the purpose of doing what my master has taught me to do. Unfortunately, though, I think oftentimes we have been unaware that there are other forms of discipleship at work on us, right? There are other forces attempting to get us to follow, to become, to do, that are actually oriented away from the kingdom of God. Now, at times, white Christianity has done a reasonably good job of identifying some of those other forms of discipleship. We've done this around, say, greed at times, or maybe around sexuality. There have been these moments where we say, we understand that there are these other cultural formations at work on us, and we need to be aware of that and be intentional so that we can actually be discipled in a different direction toward the kingdom of God. However, as best I can tell, the majority of white churches, white Christian institutions, have not identified race as one of those forms of discipleship. And yet, I think when we look at it through the lens of discipleship, we can see that racial discipleship, racial formation is at work on everybody. It doesn't matter if you're white, if you're Asian American, if you're biracial, Hispanic, if you're a recent immigrant. There is a racial formation that is orienting our desires, our assumptions toward a kind of racial hierarchy and racial injustice that we then see played out all around us. So real quickly, in this kind of pandemic moment, we see these racial inequities being exposed, right? We see who is most vulnerable to this disease because of poverty, because of health disparities, et cetera. And these play out along racial lines. So we see the results of this. But what white Christianity has often failed to do is to look at those kind of that racial formation that's orienting us in that direction. Brian Stevenson, who founded the Equal Justice Initiative, he talks about the narrative of racial difference. And he says, as absolutely horrific as slavery was, for him, the most devastating result or implication of slavery was actually this narrative that became accepted in the wider culture, which is that race has real meaning and that there is a racial hierarchy where someone's life is more valued than someone else's life. Now, ask the average person today, and everybody's gonna absolutely repudiate that. I don't believe that. Of course, that's not true. And yet again, in this pandemic moment, we see the disparities all around us. And the fact is, we have tolerated those. We have said that it's okay for certain people to suffer more than other people and to invest more resources among certain communities than other communities. So that narrative of racial difference is an example of the kind of racial discipleship that is at work on my imagination, on my assumptions, just kind of working itself into the way that I see the world and navigate the world. And I would make the case is then orienting me away from the reconciliation of the kingdom of God and instead discipling me into the segregation and the racial injustice that is so common in our society.
Okay, let's unpack that a little bit more. You mentioned that there are certain false, I don't want to say false gospels, but there are certain forces that are working on us, that are shaping us, spiritually forming us away from the image of God's kingdom that we tend to be aware of. Yeah. You mentioned greed, sexuality, some of these other things, but race, which is working on all of us, is a blind spot for an awful lot, particularly of white Christians. What came to mind when you were saying that is The Godfather. And in the original movie, the Al Pacino, Marlon Brando movie, The Godfather has this statement. He says, you keep your friends close and you keep your enemies even closer. And it makes me wonder if one of the greatest enemies of the church today has kept us so close we don't even recognize it as an enemy.
Yeah.
And I see that, when the church starts calling out all kinds of, secularisms and liberalisms and this, that, and the other, but they're not calling out things like consumerism or racism, because they're so intertwined with our realities that we don't even recognize them as a problem. Yeah, that's right. That's a really hard thing to point out to people without them getting super defensive. But then the second thing, and this is more of a question, if you take whiteness or blackness or Asianness or Latino-ness, whatever race and cultural dynamic you want to put on it, I have to believe that there are certain aspects of those identities which are consistent with the ethics of the kingdom of God and others which are not. In other words, it's not just whiteness that has a problem here that needs to be refined in the light of the gospel, but all of these different identities and cultures need to. So how do you speak to somebody who, the moment you bring up race, the moment you bring up whiteness, they just get super defensive because they see this as an attack on their entire identity?
Yeah. Boy, there's a lot there. I think that as one of the distinguishing factors of Christians is that we work to tell the truth about everything. We follow the one who claims to be not just access to the truth, but the truth itself. And so I always want to try to be precise around this, because I do think one of the ways that the enemy of God works to confuse us on this is to kind of muddle a lot of this up. So I would want to say that, yeah, absolutely, that when you look at culture and ethnicity, there are always redeeming factors. There are always things, habits, rituals that are kind of giving us glimpses of God's heart, of God's intention. I think this is God's purpose for culture and ethnicity as reflections of God's good creation, all warped by sin, of course, right? All in need of redemption. However, and this is where it gets a little tricky, when we're talking about race, we're talking about something categorically different than culture or ethnicity. Culture or ethnicity are reflections of God's intention. Race is a relatively recent invention. We don't find race in the Bible, and that's because there wasn't race in the Bible. There were other tensions, there were other social tensions, right? But race as we know it wasn't invented until, relatively recently, a handful of 100 years ago. So again, this is where I think
let me just pause there for a second, because I think there are going to be some people who hear that and their minds are being blown because they were raised in an environment where race was a given. And in fact, scripture was even used at times to justify racial identity and difference. Yeah. Going back to old theologies from the South and segregation and, the descendants of Ham and all that kind of stuff. So explain a little bit the origins of the concept of race and why it's a relatively recent category.
Yeah, I mean, the earliest uses of the word were actually just used to talk about humanity in general, the human race, right? As sort of actually a unifying thing. But then you have this sort of weird whirlwind of the Enlightenment, of scientific categorization of everything, family, genus, species, of colonial enterprises where European explorers are encountering new peoples and cultures for the first time and trying to categorize them and interpret them. You have underneath a lot of that a warped theology which had began to detach Christianity from its Jewish origins and to downplay Jesus's Jewishness and the election of Israel. Theologians will talk about this as supersessionism, and to replace Israel with the European imagination, to replace Jesus's Jewish body with I grew up in a denomination that is responsible for the white Jesus painting, Warner Sallman, which many people will be aware of. That painter came from my denomination, and we can kind of laugh and joke about, obviously Jesus didn't look like that, but in fact, that theological move began to replace that Jewish particularity with something more European in nature. So you have all of these kind of things kind of swirling around, all these different influences, and that's then when this sort of slow construction of race begins to say that there are these fixed biological categories that we can actually identify by studying skulls, for example, right, or by just observing the difference of skin color. And not only can we identify these fixed biological differences, we can ascribe meaning to them in hierarchy as well. That was always happening at the same time. It was never a neutral, hey, aren't there these interesting differences? There was always a purpose behind that to create a hierarchy. And you hear in some of the early missionary language around this, purposes or means for conversion, right? So we've identified this particular racial group and we know we can reason with them. This particular group, we're actually going to need to assimilate them first before they can believe. This group over here, they're not smart enough. We're going to have to force them to convert. So all of this is happening at the same time, and eventually comes to what we think about as these fixed racial categories today, which again, you go back a few hundred years and nobody would have been talking this way.
It's worth pointing out too that when those categories came into development and people began to see them, sorry, my dog is in here. I just gave him a bath and he keeps shaking. When people see these as fixed categories and then you mix that with biblical theology, an argument arises to say God created these different races, and if he created them as different races, then it's wrong to do anything that would dilute them. That's or right. Mix them. That's right. Or so you create these fixed groups, and the next thing you know, you have segregation and a biblically justified segregation. You have anti-misogyny laws that refuse to allow interracial marriages because that is a defiance of the way God created the natural order. Mm-hmm. And we've been trying to unpack that for the last 150 years with very little success in some places. So that, but I think some people just assume that that's how it always was. And it wasn't until the 1950s and Brown versus the Board of Education that we became enlightened and started thinking differently about race. When in fact, through most of history, we didn't think about race this way. And it's relatively late in colonialism that this all emerged. And now we're trying to shed those. And
I think that's super important.
That baggage.
Again, to think of particularly about white Christians. I think that history really matters. Now it's a painful history, right? And I think that's why we avoid it to some extent, because we have to acknowledge the fact that this racial whiteness that has ascribed some level of benefit and privilege to me is an invention, a construction with malicious intent behind it. That's a hard thing. That's a lamentable reality, right? But where the hope and the freedom for me comes in that is to say, if it hasn't always been like this, then it doesn't always have to be like this, right? And if this thing has been constructed and invented, then it's possible that there's a way to move, past this. And I don't want to say that we can fix race real quickly or we can be colorblind. None of that. But it does allow some creativity and imaginative possibility as Christians to think that what we're experiencing now is not God's intentions, and that there is creative possibility for the people of God to actually move into God's reconciliation vision for us.
So toward that end, the second half of your book, you talk more about intentional practices that can be employed to redisciple all of us, including white Christians. Let's talk about some of those. you have a number in there like the table and liturgies and things like that. So what are some things that you do in your community that have been particularly effective at revealing the dysfunction or the malformation that's happened and moving people toward an alignment with what God is calling us to be?
Yeah. So it was important to me to not just be analytical, but to be somewhat, again, imaginative. Like what could this actually look like? And I didn't want anyone reading this book to think, this isn't really for me. I want the opposite, actually. One of my hidden agendas in this book is that I think for so long we have outsourced the work of racial reconciliation to churches like mine. You say, there's an urban church on the south side of Chicago that has some racial diversity. Okay, you're the ones who are doing that work. But me over here in this suburb, in this small town, this rural community, I don't really have a role to play in this. And I wanted to reframe this work of reconciliation in such a way so that white Christian leaders would say, oh, actually, not only do I have a role to play, in some ways, I'm on the front lines of this, right? I have an opportunity to be engaged in a kind of discipleship that leads a ministry, a congregation toward solidarity with the whole body of Christ. Now that is incredibly hopeful and exciting to me, right? And I'm hoping that it's not just exciting to me. But as I thought about these practices, then I wanted to think about things that churches and ministries are already doing. I don't have to start something. You're already celebrating Holy Communion weekly, monthly. You already have children's ministry going on in your ministry, right? You're preaching on a regular basis. So I tried to take those kinds of things and say, now, how could we just reimagine these things so that they are beginning to form us, disciple us? I think about Holy Communion. Now, our church celebrates the Lord's Supper monthly. That's our tradition. I know for others it's more regular than that. It's typically myself, a white man, and our associate pastor, an African American woman, who are co-leading at the table together. I've thought about this a lot. I wonder for how many white Christians has their experience of the Lord's Supper been almost entirely segregated? They're coming to the table, whether the elements are passed to them, whether they come forward to receive them, or they kneel at an altar. How much of that has just been receiving from other white people? And I think that for many of us, that has been the case just by nature of the kind of segregation in our churches. So I think one very simple practical thing that a church can begin to do is to begin putting language to what communion is. Yes, this is a demonstration of our reconciliation with God. And we do this thing corporately. We don't send you home with a little package of communion to take at your house by yourself. I mean, this is one of the great griefs.
Unless you're in quarantine.
I was going to say, this is for me, I feel that thing. We've done it twice now in our church. I don't know about yours. And I'm standing in front of my camera, holding up and I'm doing it in faith. But boy, there's a lot of lament, right? Because we're not together. Right. And we do communion together because the reconciliation accomplished by Jesus on the cross does something to us too, that we come together across dividing lines, walls of hostility, and we participate in the body and the blood of Jesus together. We are proclaiming in that act that the Eucharistic shed blood of Jesus is a more powerfully uniting force in our lives than our biological blood. That's the testimony.
That's what I love about 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul talks about communion, and he's kind of going after the Corinthians for taking it in what he calls an unworthy manner. And this has gotten skewed in a lot of our churches and what that means. But in the context of the Corinthian Christians and what seemed to be going on is the rich and the poor were not sharing the meal together, because the rich could gather early. They didn't have to work. They enjoyed the meal. The poor would come later in the day. There's just scraps for them.
Right.
And Paul essentially says, hey, you are reflecting the social stratification of Corinth in the way you're taking this meal. And it is a direct contradiction to the cross, right? So wait for one another so that rich and poor can gather together and share it as equals, because that's what the cross is about, that you are all equal in the eyes of God. So whether it's a socioeconomic division or it's a racial division, we forget that it isn't just the cup and the bread which are symbolic of the covenant. It's the
Right.
table itself.
That's right.
Right. It's the fact that we are gathered as equals around a table where we are all guests.
Yep.
Right. It's his
Yep.
table, not ours.
And
So-
the devastating thing about that race is it blinds us to the fact that someone who could be at table with us is not at table, right?
Right.
That's that deforming discipleship, is that my imagination does not even hold space for that possibility. So I come to the table not even thinking about what could be and just being content with what actually is.
So we don't have that much time left. And I obviously recommend that people read this book and all the stuff you suggest and practical things you suggest to do. But let's stay with this communion thing for a second. Talk to us, or talk to the church out there, or the church leader or the church member out there who is in that largely white suburban church or that rural church where there isn't a lot of ethnic diversity or racial diversity. And you're saying, hey, well, what do I do when everybody in my community that I could gather at the table with is white?
Yeah.
Like, what are the options there? What are the possibilities to use the table to transform our vision of others?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think of a few different things. One, I've had this conversation with mostly rural pastors, and oftentimes we end up discovering as we talk together that their setting is a little bit more diverse than they were initially imagining it. You think about, who's serving in the restaurants or who's working in the fields, and you start poking around a little bit and you find, there are some other Christian communities in my town. I just haven't crossed paths with them, or, the pastors are bivocational, so they can't come to the pastor's monthly lunch, that we do with the other pastors in town. So I do sometimes think that there's a little bit more diversity than we're aware of. And I think I would start with that, like start building relationships there, getting to know those pastors. Maybe there's some language difficulties. Maybe there's somebody in the church who can interpret, but really let's start there. I think it can also include bringing in occasional guest preachers on those Sundays when you are celebrating the Lord's Supper, and making sure that communion is a highlight at that time. One of my mentors, an older African American man, talked about serving communion in a white town years ago, and having a man walk up, and it was being taken by intinction, so taking out the bread, dipping it in the cup, and the white pastor of the host church was serving the bread. The man took the bread, then stared at my friend in the eye, just put the bread in his mouth, and turned his back on him and wouldn't receive the cup from my friend.
Talk about an unworthy manner.
Right. Now that's an extreme example, right? But again, I go back to the question, how many of our white Christian, members and parishioners have even had the opportunity to receive the body and blood, from a leader of color? Now, the pastor in that setting could also make the point to do a little bit of teaching around that as well, right? And say, hey, this is the vision for communion. Here's the reality of our situation. And as the church, we're not going to content ourselves to that. So we're actually going to stretch ourselves in these moments to demonstrate God's intention, God's intention for us. A third thing I would suggest is, I'm convinced that the line between Holy Communion and a potluck supper is not a hard and fast line. I think that in the early church, you see this feasting that comes out of that celebration.
Right. So it was a full meal. It wasn't just a little bit of bread,
a quick ritual, right?
Wine.
Yeah. So our church does our monthly potluck on Communion Sundays, and it's we celebrate the Lord's Supper, and then we do the benediction right into the communion time, and so we're sitting around tables catching up on our lives. I think that can happen in any congregation. I imagine a predominantly white church getting to know, let's say, a Hispanic congregation in town or the next town over. And maybe they've decided to partner on a VBS or something like that. But there's enough intentionality around that they're actually going to come together occasionally for a meal as well. But at that meal, they're going to choose to celebrate the Lord's Supper together. That's the kind of reimagining for me that I think once a leader starts to see the possibility of leading their congregation more and more toward the reconciled kingdom of God, you start to see, you know what, I don't have to create a whole new program to make this happen, right? With a little bit of rethinking on this, we can actually start to make a big difference in how our people are being discipled. So now that, let's just imagine that child growing up in that predominantly white church, he or she is growing up in an environment where they regularly are worshiping with, a Hispanic congregation, where they are growing up receiving the elements from a Spanish speaking, pastor, where they're sitting around tables or doing a VBS together. So for me, that's what I want to get at. I want to start thinking about those small ways of reimagining existing practices that I believe can have a pretty significant impact.
I think a case could be made that they'll actually have a far greater impact than creating some independent, isolated, this is our ministry of racial reconciliation, or this is our ministry of it's tweaking what you're already doing is going to have a more sustained, less siloed. Yeah. Like people make this argument about missions, right? You have a missions department or a missions committee. It's like, no. We need missions to permeate all that we are and do as a church. Likewise, the unity and reconciliation across the divisions of our society needs to permeate all that we do, not just a special category.
We're not outsourcing it to the reconciliation team who they already care about it anyways, right? Like, no, that's not right. And likewise, many of these things are the practices that the church globally has been living into for centuries, saying this is how we are discipled together in the way of Jesus. And so they're trustworthy in that way for us to go back to.
Well, I appreciate this, not just because racial divisions are such a prominent and ongoing issue in our culture, but the wisdom that you are demonstrating both in your leadership and in the book can apply to all kinds of divisions that are going on: socioeconomic, political, cultural, indeed racial. So thank you for that. Appreciate it. Thank you for your book, Rediscipling the White Church. I don't have it in front of me. What's the subtitle again?
There it is. From Cheap Diversity to True Solidarity.
Excellent. And it's available anywhere you buy a book, I imagine.
That's right.
Okay. Right. Well, you guys should go out and check it out. David Swanson, thank you for being with us, and I can't wait to have you back on.
Thanks a lot, Skye. This was really, really great. Appreciate it.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Skye Pilot Media, that's Skye's company. Production assistance by Sean McDuffie, edited by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news.